Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us today for our author talk with Myriam. My name is Suyani. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the Women's Program Curator for the New Haven Pride Center. Before we begin our event, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Sattatuck, Golden Hill Pagaset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. From wherever you are, please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands we all occupy and the history of the places we are in. You can find out more about Native lands at native-land.ca. Before we begin, I also want to thank today's sponsor, CT for Humanities, as well as oh my gosh, I just forgot the name. Ooh. The new bookstore here in New Haven called Possible Futures. And Lauren, thank you guys so much for being able to support us so that we can ensure that we pay our speakers and artists equitably. And so for today's program, we're going to be speaking with Myriam, and I would love to introduce Emily Adams, who will do a quick synopsis of the book and introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Emily. I use she, they pronouns. Today we'll be talking about Mean with author Myriam Gurba. True crime memoir and ghost story, Mean is the bold and hilarious tale of Myriam Gurba's coming of age as a queer, mixed-race Chicana. Blending radical formal fluidity and caustic humor, Gurba takes on sexual violence, small towns, and race, turning what might be tragic into piercing, revealing comedy. This is a confident, intoxicating, brassy book that takes the cost of sexual assault, racism, misogyny, and homophobia deadly seriously. Welcome, Myriam. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us your pronouns and a bit about yourself?
Yes. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am based in California. I'm a former high school teacher. I taught high school for about 20 years, and I am now a full-time writer.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just dive right into the questions. So
Sure.
While writing this book, what were some of the feelings that came up for you during it, and how were those feelings the same or different once the book was published?
It's difficult to generalize regarding feelings that emerged during the writing process for Mean, because it took me a very long time to write that book, and it wasn't written consistently over time. It was written in segments, and so there were periods of time where I took breaks from the work and just let it let the creativity as it related to that book be fallow. But it was a difficult book to write, and in one respect, it was a comforting book to write. And I imagine that likely sounds kind of strange considering the subject matter, because there's so much violence threaded through the book. Writing that book gave me an opportunity to write really lovingly about certain people and about certain places. And when I was in the thick of completing that book and revising it, I was trapped in an abusive relationship that involved domestic violence. And that lasted for approximately 3 years. And that was the time that I did the most work on that book. And so that book actually became like a cave for me to crawl into, where I could get away from my abuser. And so the book became a haven and a refuge for me, because that book was something that my abuser couldn't touch.
Oh. So do you still feel that that haven or like that gratefulness for it? Now it's about 5 years after it's the first publication.
I don't know that I necessarily feel, well, you know what? I do feel grateful for it. I suppose in a sense, that book, working on the book, doing the labor of working on the book and doing the labor of commemorating the experiences of survivors as well as my own survivorship, that gave me something very concrete to live for, as well as something spiritual to live for. So in a sense, that book project enabled me to survive domestic violence.
Were you expecting it to be such a lifeline like that? Well,
no. I didn't. Like when I began the process of writing the book, I was married to a woman, and it was after we divorced that I met another person who initiated me into like a cycle of domestic violence. And so when I started writing the book, I didn't intend to write a book. I wrote fragments, and the fragments were intended to be experiments. And then I realized that I was really enjoying the process of writing these fragments. And the fragments themselves were intended as like small rebellions against what I guess I could call sort of normative rape narratives that tend to have these very redemptive arcs to them and tend to have very specific kinds of protagonists. They tend to have perfect survivors. And the book that I was most strongly reacting to was Alice Sebold's Lucky. And so in a sense, you could say that Mean is written as a reactionary response to Alice Sebold's Lucky. Like I read Lucky, and on the one hand, I appreciated holding in my hands a document of survivorship. But on the other hand, that book is incredibly problematic racially.
Sounds very challenging. Was there anything else that surprised you while writing this? Or, well, it sounds like there's a lot going on, or any of the fragments that while you were writing really was like aha moment?
Anything that surprised me? Well, I suppose like something that happens for me as a writer, and I know that it happens for quite a few other writers as well, is that when one is writing, one often enters into what feels like a trance-like state. And it can feel almost as if what you're writing isn't being internally generated. It almost feels as if you're receiving a story. And there are moments, for example, where I'll be writing very furiously, especially when I'm writing prose that's more poetic. And there will be moments where I will use certain words that I didn't know that I knew. And so that will startle me. I'll be like, I didn't know I knew that word. Wait a minute, what does that even mean? So that happened in some of the poetic sections. That would kind of startle me. And I know there are a lot of other writers who have similar experiences, or who share that trait. One of the other things that I discovered while working on Mean was that I realized how much it is that I write with my body. And what I mean by that isn't superficial. It's not that I'm writing like this, right? But what I intend to say by writing with my body is that I let physical sensation guide me, and physical sensation confirms for me whether or not I am achieving what I want to with the prose. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So if I work on a piece of prose, so I'm working on a segment of this book, and it feels unfinished and it feels uncooked. Once what I have wanted to do is achieved, I will often get a just right sensation somewhere in my body, often like in my abdomen or in my stomach. So that's an example of like writing with the body. Like you pay attention to your body and your body kind of guides you in the writing and in the storytelling.
That makes sense. Do you think it's connected to how like your writing is almost conducted through, like you feel it from outwards?
Yes. Yeah. I think that that's the case. And so when I write now, I pay a lot of attention to my body head to toe. And I'm also a writer who paces a lot. I have to walk, and then I do laps around my house because it's stimulating to do that, and it gets me away from the word wall, because a screen eventually starts to look like a wall of words, and it almost is like you can almost lose sight of the prose and the words. And so to step away from it and to move your body also refreshes your body, and more specifically refreshes your eyes. So it's kind of like I'm like shaking off the residue of like stale language.
Oh, that's very informative, the physicality of it. Can you outline the thought process behind reclaiming labels that were once used to hurt you? And do you think your intersectionality as a queer Mexican woman has had any impact on you needing to use labels as a sort of armor?
Let's see. So I have always enjoyed wordplay. I come from a family where there is constant wordplay, and like a lot of my father's humor is rooted in punning. And so I inherited that affinity for puns and wordplay from him. And then my mother's sense of humor isn't as like lexical. Her sense of humor is more absurd and surreal. And I inherited that too. So between like the wordplay and the surrealness, things can get a little strange. But because I value wordplay so much, I do think that like I do believe that one way of sort of disarming bigots and chipping away at like bigotry is to poke fun at bigots and the language that they use. I suppose that can become a way of punching down, although it can be difficult and complicated, and at times one can be led astray. But I really enjoy playing with language in order to diffuse some of the bite and some of the hate. And I learned very early on that if you take certain language from oppressors and from abusers and you begin to use it, it loses its power. because the target of the language is now using that language. And if that target is seemingly comfortably using that language, it no longer has teeth. It's as if you've defanged it. So I think that is something that I engage in often, but I don't necessarily do it consciously. It's a part of the way that I live and speak and relate to the world.
That's very interesting. Like, it's kind of like the opposite of armor, almost like the offensive for bigots and the other side.
Yes.
So please discuss the title and your experience with mean in a superficial way versus oppression, bigotry, the cruelty of people.
So, I like titles. I love titles because titles are like the ambassador of the work, and like they need to do an excellent job of announcing the work. And I think that really succinct titles do that well, like one word monosyllabic titles can do that. Those have always really grabbed me. Like, for example, Mary Roach's book on human cadavers. Its title was Stiff, and like that like really pulled me in. So I really like those sorts of very short, punchy titles that get to the point. And then I also like the inverse. I also like really long, extravagant, excessive titles too. I don't like moderation in titles. And so I settled on mean for several reasons. I like the word mean because it has multiple meanings. And so when I chose that as the title, I intended it to be looked at, or for it to be interpreted in two distinct ways. Mean as in meaning, because mean is an attempt to make meaning of these horrific events that took place in my hometown. What do they mean? And so I think that many survivors on our path to healing, to recovery, and in our attempts to repair what was harmed, we become obsessed with trying to find out, trying to learn why, and trying to make the experiences that we endured matter in some way. So we try to imbue them with some sort of meaning. And so I chose that word because I felt like I could very, very succinctly communicate the philosophy that underpins mean, which is I'm trying to make meaning out of horror. But looked at differently, and I think most people's interpretation of the title is of mean in terms of like the protagonist Myriam as a quote unquote mean girl, because I discuss meanness throughout the memoir, and I use this notion of meanness as a lens through which to examine girlhood, adolescence, white supremacist dynamics, etc. And I use mean in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. I don't necessarily mean. So, and what I mean by that is that I think that in many ways that memoir is a meditation, not so much on meanness, but on cruelty. And cruelty exists along a continuum. And so often, different forms of cruelty are conflated, and we're offered these false equivalencies in terms of cruelties, right? And And I'll give an example of those, but not necessarily from the memoir. So somebody sets fire to somebody else's home, right? So that's incredibly fucking cruel to like commit arson and destroy somebody's home. And then somebody rushes out of their home nearby and begins screaming out the top of their lungs, fire, fire, fire. And people say, shh, be quiet. You should not be screaming. You are causing disorder in this neighborhood. They're conflating the calamity caused by somebody screaming that there's a fire with the fact there's an actual fire. And I think that survivors often deal with this type of conflation where we will be brutally assaulted, but what is socially unacceptable is our discussion of it. That's rude. That's mean. We're pissing on somebody's parade by sharing our lived experiences. And so I really wanted to be kind of cheeky with this notion of mean, because I often get told that I'm mean when I don't think I'm being mean. I think I'm being honest with compassion, but also honest in a very direct way.
And people are kind of conflating the. That makes sense. It's very clever, all the different meanings and layers to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. In the during our book club discussion and things, we did not think of the initial meaning that you were talking about. That adds a lot to it. Thank you so much for sharing. So on page 115, there's the found poem. Did this found poem build Sophia's ghost for you, or did it more so help deconstruct it? And why did you include this if you hate found poems?
So did the found poem assist me with sort of accessing her Sophia Torres's ghost, or did it or was it a way of deconstructing her ghost? So that's the first question, right? So one thing that I want to make clear is that when I write about ghosts, I'm not writing metaphorically. I'm writing in a real way. Like I actually have a relationship with this ghost. And I come from, I'm descended from a lineage of people that interacts with spirits and ghosts. So that is part of like my cultural tradition and my heritage. And so I had long had this relationship with Sophia, and very much wanted to find a way to honor her, but I also wanted to expose the brutal way in which she died, and also the really grotesque and demeaning way that she was treated in death. And so I had to mirror that and recreate that in the prose. And I decided on a found poem for several reasons. Sophia was a houseless, mentally ill migrant woman born in Chihuahua, Mexico. And there is very little biographical information about her in any archive. So the archive that I primarily relied on to write Mean was legal. So the murder case involving her and the sexual assault cases involving other plaintiffs and myself are one of the only archives in which there's biographical information about Sofia. And because Tommy Martinez was sentenced to die, he has a very long appeals process to go through. And with each appeal, there is a filing, and those files are huge. And so those files are what I had to rely on to get to know Sofia. And there is very, very, very little about her life in those files. The most information about her that was in those files was in the autopsy report. Her autopsy report and the description of what likely happened to her the night that she died, and the description of her murder, of where she was murdered, where her life was taken, all of those were longer than the synopsis of her life. And so I did not have much to go on, which meant that if I was going to build some sort of memento to her, this was all I had, was an autopsy report, a description of the place where she was murdered, and this very, very brief biography, and a few comments made by her family during the trial. And I did not know what I could do with these pieces of information. Because I reference Ana Mendieta, who would make the silhouettes, I figured that I could honor Mendieta by creating a silhouette of Sofia's body. So she receives her own silhouette in Mean.
Wow. It's very powerful and very painful that was all that was left of her. Wow. So you said Ana Mendieta was a big inspiration, or had a big impact on you. So much similar to that, in the beginning of the book, you have the quote by Jenny Rivera, roughly translating to, "The best I can wish you is to do badly." What does Jenny Rivera mean to you, and why that quote?
So Jenny Rivera is was a Mexican-American singer, and she was hugely popular, hugely successful, an international star, although she's not well recognized in the United States. And I wrote a lot of Mean in Long Beach, and Jenny Rivera was from Long Beach. And Jenny Rivera, in her music, sang about many themes that have historically been considered masculine. So she sings about fighting. She sings about brawling. She sings about drinking. She sings about violence, and these are themes that are taboo when it comes to women in music in Latin America. And so I very much appreciate her spirit. And Jen Rivera was very open about being a domestic violence survivor and also being a rape survivor. And so she is yet another survivor who I wanted to honor. So there are survivors threaded all throughout the memoir. And so I wanted to open with the words of a fellow survivor. And that's from a song called Inolvidable, Unforgettable, where she describes herself as the most unforgettable person that anybody will ever meet, and that they're lucky to have met her. And that, if you mistreat her, all she can hope for you is that your life will turn to shit, that things will go badly for you. And so I imagined her singing that to the man who sexually assaulted me. Like, I imagined her saying, the best that I can hope for you is that your life sucks and turns to shit. And so what I wanted to do was open on a note of bitterness and resentment, because so often survivor memoirs are supposed to have a redemption arc. And I wanted to start with, no, let us hold on to our resentment. Let us hold on to our bitterness until we're ready to let go of it. Because so frequently our bitterness and our resentment makes other people uncomfortable. And so I wanted for people to get sort of an acrid taste of what they were going to find in the work.
Oh, that's a very honest way of going about it, and like matches with your theme of it. So some also in the beginning of the book, this book is dedicated to the restless but not the young.
Yeah.
Who was your target audience, and what kind of person do you think would benefit most from reading Mean?
So my target audience when I write about survivorship is often other survivors. I'm writing for them, and so frequently, in order to understand my location in the world, I have to understand the location of others in the world because we're interdependent. And often I have to see my experiences mirrored by somebody else for me to be able to understand my experiences, and then also for me to be able to language my experiences. So I wrote it for other survivors, and what I really wanted to communicate to women and girls and non-binary and queer people and all sorts of like gender diverse folks who come to the book is that so often when it comes to survivorship and when it comes to sexual violence, we're allotted a story. So there is the story of the time I got sexually harassed, or the time I got sexually abused, or the time I got raped, and we're allotted one. But if we have 2 stories or 3 stories, people begin to question us. And I've had people say to me before, for example, these things happen to you. Things like this have happened to you 3 or 4 times. Maybe you're the problem. And I am not the problem. Misogyny is the problem. And I'm bothered by the way that space is sometimes made for a story and not a lifetime of harm. Because if you're a minoritized person, chances are you're going to experience a lifetime of harm, because it's not as if we magically lose our minoritized status after we've been raped. You know what I mean? It's like, no, if you are, let's say, like, if you're a racially minoritized person and you're queer, you're going to be targeted for violence across your lifespan. So you're going to have myriad stories to share and myriad stories to tell. And we should be able to tell them, and we should be able to like draw an arc. And I sometimes joke that every woman has a true crime book in her. Starting from childhood, because like it fucking sucks to be a woman. And so I invite people to like write that true crime book that you carry, because every minoritized person has one, you know?
Without having to like sanitize it and then make it so much like nicer when it's not nice. There's problems behind it.
Exactly. And one of the other things that I really wanted to do with Mean also was to complicate the idea of true crime, because there's a formula and there's like an element of titillation that often happens. And in true crime, part of that formula is typically an elevation and a glorification of law enforcement. And I wanted to avoid that completely. I wanted to tell the story of a survivor who did not cooperate with law enforcement, who was like, I'm out of here. And to also add these supernatural elements. And I know that some readers are bothered by the classification of the book as true crime because they do expect that formula. And then instead they get this experimental coming of age memoir with a ghost. And they're like, wait a minute, this is not Law and Order. Where's Mariska Hargitay? So I wanted to complicate that.
Seems much more revealing by like including all the different realities of it, all those overlaps.
That's what I wanted. That's what I was striving for. Thank you.
So you no longer teach high school, but somewhat related, have students ever approached you about this work or your other works, and how have those in your personal life reacted to this book?
So, I have certainly had students ask me questions about that book and engage me regarding the book. And I developed a pretty standard response for my students. I taught high school, so I taught 9th through 12th grade. And then different years, I taught, I would like largely have students from a certain grade level. So sometimes I'd have all 9th graders, sometimes I'd have like all 12th graders, right? But this became my fairly standard answer to my students. Like often during the first month of school, a student would either approach me after class, like they'd linger and then approach me after class. Or there were also instances when like we would be, you know, all seated together. It would be instructional time. And then a student who wanted to distract me and walk me away from the curriculum would raise their hand and then say, I heard you wrote a book. And what I would say to the students is, yes, I wrote a book. If you are interested in talking to me about literature and about a writer's life, and about memoirs, we can do that after class, because I don't teach English. I taught civics, economics, psychology, and history. So I'm not a writing teacher. And so I would tell them, like, I'm more than happy to talk to you about your interest in my work as a writer outside of school or outside of class time. And then that would usually shut it down, because often a student would just do that to distract. And then one or two like super nerdy or artsy kids would usually show up who were actually serious about wanting to know. And so I would entertain their questions. But what I would often tell them was this. I would say, this is a memoir. You know, Mean is a memoir. It is very revealing. There's explicit sexual content in it. There's extremely violent content in it. And I would tell my students, there are things that I don't know about you, and there are things you don't know about me that make it easier for us to have a teacher-student relationship. And I would say, I'm not going to tell you that you can't read the book, because that's going to make it more attractive to you. But what I am going to say is, it would be better for you to read the book when I'm no longer your teacher, because then what you know about me won't cloud our experience together. And usually kids would abide by the suggestion, but every once in a while a kid would come strolling in with a copy of it. And what can you do, you know?
Yeah. Wow. Great. Wow. I wouldn't expect them to be so interested about like the writing aspect, versus I think a lot of times kids, especially at the high school age group, are kind of into the emotional side, especially with getting on that side of their teacher.
Yeah. I mean, there would be kids who would want to connect with me emotionally, and who would come to me for confessional purposes. But that was not necessarily triggered by knowing that I was a writer and knowing that I wrote about the subjects that interest me. I think for various reasons, I cultivated rapport with my students, and then they would seek me out for emotional connection and for, like I said, confessional purposes.
Makes sense. Another question. Assuming that when your dad told you that meanness or bad things makes the world more interesting, assuming that had a lasting impression on you, have you ever talked to him about it? And did this interact the way that you speak to children or with those that you teach?
I mean, I think that statement on my father's behalf, I think it was like a really fucked up thing to say. But I also think that like I had really put my dad on the spot. Like, I'm like, what? I'm like, I don't remember how old I was when that happened. I was maybe like 8 years old. And when you're 8 years old and you suddenly spring this really intense philosophical question on a parent, they're not prepared to explain the epistemology of cruelty to a child. You know what I mean? And so he did what he always does, which is he just thinks on his feet and tells me like, you know, whatever comes to mind. And sometimes it's really not the soundest response. And I haven't really spoken to him about his having said that. But I did like incorporate that statement into like my childhood spirituality. Like when I would see cruelty enacted in the world, like I would sometimes tell myself, is this happening for my entertainment? Because my dad told me that, that this is supposed to happen to be the spice of life. So no, I've never confronted him about that. But that is, if I were to have children, that is not an aphorism I would impart to them, and it's not something I would share with young people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, at one point in the book, you describe when you are in an anthropology lecture and someone interrupts by announcing the OJ trial verdict. What's your purpose in sharing this interaction or this intersection of academic racism and pop culture? And how do you want the audience to view this additional example of misogyny and emphasis on the larger racial impact?
So I came of age in the 90s, and the trial of O.J. Simpson for the murder of Nicole Brown is, in many people's estimation, like the trial of the 20th century. And so that trial dominated social life. Like for months, that was all anybody talked about. That was all anybody cared about. People were riveted. And what that trial taught me is that it is perfectly acceptable for men to kill women. And what was incredibly horrifying for me as a teenager was to watch Simpson in his Bronco with his best friend, evading law enforcement, taking them on a slow speed chase throughout Los Angeles County. And this was televised live. And throngs of people showed up along the streets to cheer him on. And people had made signs using bedding. They had made sheets. Go, OJ, go. We love you, OJ. We love you. It was nothing but love for this man who had decapitated his wife. And everybody thought that he would be found guilty because there was so much evidence. And then for him to be acquitted was shocking to me. And what really cemented for me that women are killable in this country was the flippant attitude that people had toward Nicole Brown's death. To announce that a man who perpetrated femicide is now free, and to proclaim the juice is loose, because that was from a chewing gum commercial. That was from a Wrigley's chewing gum commercial. The juice is loose meant a wonderful flavor is filling your mouth. That was a slogan from a commercial from the 90s. To associate that with this man who had decapitated his wife going free really illustrated for me what kind of country I live in. And so I wanted to capture that moment to show how flippant people were about femicide and how flippant people my own age were. They found ways to laugh about it and to celebrate it.
Sounds very overwhelming, especially for a teenager.
Yeah. Yes. Like the two cases that dominated my teen years that really shaped my understanding of misogyny were the Anita Hill hearings, and the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. Like both of those shaped my understanding of misogyny.
For those unfamiliar myself, what is the Anita Hill?
So Anita Hill was a lawyer who reported that Clarence Thomas, who was to be appointed to the Supreme Court, was a misogynist. He had sexually harassed her grotesquely. And she suggested that perhaps a misogynist who sexually harasses women is not a candidate for the highest court in the United States. And she was treated horrifically by a Senate committee, and that Senate committee was led by Joe Biden, who treated her awful. Just, it was grotesque. And I remember like people glued to their TVs watching this, and so many people calling her a liar, and watching her be called a liar communicated to me that if I were to speak about the experiences that I had had, I would likely be met with the same dismissal and be painted as a liar as well. And I think that happened for a lot of girls of that generation. We saw those Senate hearings and the message was loud and clear.
What a message.
Yeah.
Seems very overpowering every element of life.
Totally.
Getting close to 8, so I do want to check some of the questions. So Yanni asked, I know ghosts are mentioned throughout Mean, and you're speaking on feeling the writing through your body. Do you consider yourself a spiritual person? And okay. And how is it connected to your culture? Which I feel like you did mention a bit. Would you like to expand upon that?
Sure. I'll speak a little bit about it. For a very long time, I resisted spirituality. And now that I am like in a safe home, I'm free from abuse, I'm able to thrive, I no longer feel that I have to wear so much armor. And so I'm able to cultivate my spirituality much more. And my spirituality is very culturally, all forms of spirituality are rooted in culture. And much of my spirituality is shaped by my Mexican ancestry. And I'll say that I was raised Catholic, and I do continue to practice some Catholicism, but the way that I'll phrase the type of Catholicism that I practice is as folk Catholicism. And what I mean by that is there are elements of many other traditions and practices woven into the Catholicism that I practice. So much so that it might even become unrecognizable as Catholicism and might look like witchcraft or magic to some people. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think that explains it in witchcraft. What do you want to talk about that no interviewer asks about?
Oh, what do I want to talk about that no interviewer asks me about? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. You know what? Nobody, like, people always want to ask me like super heavy questions, but like nobody ever wants to ask me these light questions. Like, what's your favorite kind of cookie? Or like, or favorite flower? Or like, what would be your ideal Wednesday night? Like, nobody ever asks me these like kind of fun throwaway questions that I think are really important for people to get to know one another. And so like when I what's my favorite cookie? My favorite, oh God, I love cookies. I mean, I like a classic chocolate chip cookie fresh out of the oven, like with big pieces of chocolate.
The crunchy or the like falling apart?
Yes, like gooey. I really like baking. Like I'm really, really into baking. Like I had a difficult morning, and so I decided to console myself with cobbler. So I baked like an all berry. Like I threw in all the berries and I made like this cobbler that like just smells like it smells like if a maternal hug had a smell, it would be this cobbler.
It sounds like a great coping.
Totally. Yeah, cooking is self-care. Yeah.
You said favorite cookie. There was ideal Wednesday night.
Okay, so like my ideal Wednesday night would be like maybe to like go eat really good Mexican food at a not very busy kind of hole in the wall restaurant. And then go for like a stroll in Los Angeles and then watch the sunset. And then come home and watch Real Housewives. And maybe have a little smoke and then have some really good sex. Like that would be a really nice Wednesday night.
Sounds like a perfect Wednesday night.
Right?
Awesome. Last question. What are your plans for future writing? You said that you're now a full-time writer, and you stated that this is not a coming out story. Do you plan on writing more about queerness or future plans with that?
Yeah, so I am working on an essay collection right now. It's already sold. So I sold it on proposal, which means that proposals are kind of funny in the publishing world. You basically write a book about the book that you want to write. And then you take that book about the book you want to write and you take it to various publishing houses. And then you say, will you give me money to write the book that I described in this book that I wrote for you? and then if you're lucky, they say yes. And then they give you an advance so that you can live off of that advance as you give them the book that you promised them. And so I sold this book on proposal. It's called Creep. And it is very much about how oppression and abuse are not phenomena that flow from like singular people. So often we want to identify an individual as the source of oppression or abuse. And so what I'm trying to illustrate through these various essays, and they're all personal essays, is that oppression and abuse always require an ecosystem and an environment. And so any serious attempt to disrupt and dismantle and rebuild abusive systems requires us to take an approach to an entire environment and ecosystem. We can't just say, oh, Harvey Weinstein's been fired. No, 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 no. That's not how it works. And so I'm attempting to demonstrate that through these various essays. And one of the essays is about my experience of writing Mean and the domestic violence that I was living through as I wrote that book. And then I'm also freelancing as well.
Ooh. And you said that's the essays will be called Creep?
Yeah, the working title of the essay collection is Creep, and it's been sold to Simon & Schuster.
Ooh, we will definitely be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Ooh, all right. All right, Myriam, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I think we found it very illuminating about your story, and we're definitely on the lookout for those future essay collections. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.